we have just about an hour, which is really great because we are accompanied here by three very well-respected attorneys and who are known for their intelligence as well as their loquaciousness. So we will give each of them a few minutes to introduce themselves as well as their areas of expertise. I want to invite you all. We have some topics we're going to cover, but if you have any questions for the panelists, you are very welcome to tweet them at me at jory.com on Twitter, and I'd be happy to work those into the conversation. We have to say, as Wendy likes to tell me, that these lawyers are not your lawyers. So, bear that in mind. Definitely, if you have specific questions related to your projects, you should retain your own counsel. Friends, our safe word today is amicus brief. So if we're going on too long, just kidding, we can use that to skip to the next question. But I would like to start maybe with my colleague Jamie, if you don't mind sharing a few minutes of introducing yourself and your areas of expertise, please.
Hi, I'm Jamie Clark. I grew up in Minnesota. I live in LA now. I am from and currently the general counsel of the open standards and open source group Oasis, which created a lot of stuff over the last 20 years or so, although not quite as much as Wendy's group, who's been terribly prolific. We probably lived mostly in the e-commerce and structured documents area. So if you've heard of Oasis, you've heard about it either because of security stuff like SAML or Stix and Taxi, or you've heard about it because of structured e-government stuff like open document format. I happened into this because when I was a baby lawyer a long time ago, I had some clients come to me and say, so I got some salesmen from a large company that wanted to sell me all this electronic stuff, and I don't have to use paper anymore. I can reduce it all to records and have it all be electronic. Only I just don't know if any of that will work if I go to the court and say, Your Honor, here's my contract, and I hope, show them this paper or this tape or something. Does that work? Is it enforceable? And in 1998 or so, it wasn't. So I got dragged into about 15 years of trying to make sure electronic signatures actually were recognized as legal signatures, which, as you know, is kind of old hat now. But boy, were courts confused by those things in the first place. And so eventually I went to my wife and say, honey, can I go work for a foundation and take a pay cut of about 9/10 of my salary and do cool internet stuff for the rest of my life? And she said, oh, fine if you have to. So here I am working for Oasis, mostly helping keep their open source and open standards programs on the straight and narrow and kind of doing things in ways that are cooperative and usually not illegal, immoral, or fattening. We are all lawyers in different roles, and I just want to say our job is actually pretty well predicted. I mean, you could actually do a UML chart for our job because the idea is as a package, we're supposed to take all those crazy bad things can happen to you and roll them up into black boxes and give you rules and suggestions and guidelines and templates for how to do your thing without having to think about us, and then we're supposed to basically disappear. Basically, if facilitators and lawyers and rules people and license people do a good job of creating your community and helping you guide through stuff and figure out what to avoid, then you can just go off and be devs and work on stuff and have committees and cooperate and never have to crack a rule book or a Robert's rules or a procedure thing or a license. We really ought to be just making it possible for people to collaborate in a safe space without running into, multiple kinds of legal problems. So if we do our job well, hopefully we become invisible. So far, not so good.
I usually refer to us as an API to the rest of the legal system, where hopefully you don't have to worry about the implementation details. Sometimes it does leak through. So hi, I'm Luis Villa. I am an attorney, former programmer. I got involved in my baby lawyer story is that I was at Zimian, which some of you may remember as a Linux desktop startup in the very distant past. We got acquired by Novell. I was involved in the diligence there and dealing with Novell's lawyers, and I naively, arrogantly thought, oh, I can do better than this. And so anyway, since then I've been slowly learning how wrong that was. First at Mozilla, Then for a while at Greenberg Traurig, big law firm working with many of you probably worked for companies that were my clients then. Then at Wikimedia, and now at a startup called Tidelift. What we do at Tidelift is we are building a platform to help open source developers get paid for making open source work better, right? We believe you can think of it almost as a Red Hat for the rest of the stack, where we make things more secure, more reliable, we make the legal stuff go more smoothly. And in exchange, enterprises pay us for that, and we pay the actual developers who are doing the work, right? The original open source developers, not some random schmo in the cloud or a contractor, but the people who actually created the value. Because we think, open source has created literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of value, and it's time for open source developers to capture even a tiny little fragment of that. If that can be done, then we will all be better off, right? Both the developers who capture some of that value and hopefully the companies that are our customers by making it a little more robust. And my interest in this stuff has always been about licensing and about how people work together, and licensing is a way that happens, though not the only way. So yeah, I guess, yeah, with that.
Thank you. I'm Wendy Seltzer. I am strategy lead and counsel at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. I got there through a winding path of interest in law and open source, and in the early days of fighting the copyright term extension and copyright claim overreach. I founded the Chilling Effects Clearinghouse project, now known as Lumen Database, tracking notice and takedown requests and giving people the legal information to help them fight back against misguided requests. And like Lewis and Jamie, my interest has been in the ways that law can help creative people do the things that they want to do without the law getting in the way, whether that's artists creating works that build upon the creative works of others and add new things to our cultural discourse, fighting some of the copyright restrictions, or coders trying to work together to develop interoperable platforms that anyone can use without paying patent royalties to someone who comes in, asserting that everything you've made is, an infringement of their patent. I think law can actually help in creating and reinforcing common infrastructure. So the best uses of law I think of are things like patent commitments and copyleft, places where people agree not to assert legal claims against one another, but to pool their resources and create opportunities for them and others to build value on top of this shared infrastructure. So at W3C, I work on our process and our patent policy to help make that work for the ways that people are developing web standards.
So that sets us
Joy,
up.
let me say one thing.
Oh.
Wendy's way too shy. Wendy is on the board of directors of Tor. She was one of the early staff members at EFF. I mean, I just try and get cool by standing around her. So read her resume. She's got an incredible background. We're both basically the legal people at two large standards consortiums, but she's the cool one.
Well, you get to keep that one. Agreed. +1. Wendy, badass. You've also set us up really nicely to talk about a text that has been kind of making the rounds quite a bit in the open source world and also among your community as well, which is the Eleanor Ostrom's work on governing the commons. And we have talked a lot about sort of the commons, common infrastructure support, but then there's also this idea of the tragedy of the commons, that it's doomed to fail. And we started with a really lovely conversation last night. You said it really well, Lewis, that not all commons are tragic. I wonder if you could introduce us to that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think one way that we think of ourselves is as engineers of healthy commons, right? And there's this, I think for a long time, particularly in the US, but globally, a lot of economists have pushed this vision of the tragedy of the commons, right? Mm-hmm. And that all commons ultimately are overrun. People take too much and give too little. And I wanted to set the table a little bit for today's conversation by saying that actually Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009, I believe, um, devoted her career to studying all the commons that aren't tragic, right, that do succeed. And she identified over 900 commons in her research. Often they were water commons. In fact, some of them originally in LA. And I then spent a career and the careers of many grad students identifying common themes, right? What are things that actually make those commons work? And I'm going to go through and highlight a few of these, and they are all going to sound very familiar to you because you're going to have seen them in the communities that you are part of that work well. You're going to have seen them. They're going to ring a bell, right? So one thing that she talked about is clearly defined boundaries. You have to know who's in and who's out, right? Modularity is the word that we use for this in our space, right? We know who's participating, how they participate in a way that's very clear for everybody. There's proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. In other words, you don't want people who are purely free riding. You want to have hopefully some way for them to contribute. She talks about monitoring. You have to know how it's being used. This is something, frankly, that open source maybe doesn't do so well and could learn from, right? Where we have a sense of our stars on GitHub and our npm counts, but that's maybe about it, right? She talks about fast and fair conflict resolution, right? The more clear things are, the better for everybody. This is one of the things that we try to bring in our work is making sure, and one of the things I'm most proud of in my career is the Mozilla Public License version 2, where it's a copyleft, but it's a copyleft with very clear boundaries. A couple others that I think I'll skip over here, but the point that I wanted to drive home is that there are patterns that we can know and follow in making healthy communities. This is not magic. It's not, it's not something that we have to reinvent all these wheels. And hopefully that's something that lawyers can help with as you all focus on the technology.
Let me contextualize that a little bit. What's the point of that list? Well, it got Lynn Ostrom the Nobel, and that's nice, but also you'll find a bunch of public policy issues. You'll find WTO principles about standards and what's a real standard and what's a fake standard. You'll find accreditation bodies in both open source and open standards that test bodies to say, okay, are we going to allow you to submit yourself to other places? Are governments going to include your stuff in their procurement requirements? And they test a lot of those same conditions. Furthermore, those are the preconditions to fairness. If you're putting in effort, are you likely to get something out of it? Are you likely to get railroaded? Are you likely to get big-footed? The simple way to look at that stuff from your standpoint, whether it's not just in node.js, which is fairly mature now and has a pretty good governance system so far, but in any open source or open development shared project is, if you have that stuff there, if you can detect fair conflict resolution, modularity, transparency, yada, 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 then you're probably in a good place and your work's probably going to work out pretty well, or at least you're going to get a fair shot. If those things are not present, if you're designing a community and you haven't provided for that, or if you're in a place and they don't those things, the project has a very strong chance of failing. So you might think of them almost as health indicators for open shared projects, which includes standard stuff like Wendy's organization of mine and ISO and ANSI and everybody else have been doing for 30, 40 years, but also includes the next open source project created tomorrow.
Jamie, one other thing that you had pointed out was that that in a similar vein, that standards development organizations kind of get evaluated on the same principles. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Well, we've been doing some interesting engineering lately because the traditional sources of open development, like open standards groups, like Wendy's and mine, have all been under, we think, good market pressure to adopt open source methods and tools. And so you wouldn't have seen a lot of SourceForge material in the mainstream of a W3C recommendation or OASIS standard 10 years ago. There was some, because we've always had our standards sort of supported by and SourceForge pre-GitHub open source builds as kind of proofs of concept. But in terms of where the actual, the canonical standard lives, now you can go to GitHub and find a lot of them for W3C or Oasis, and increasingly, even some of the ISOs and the fuddy-duddies, I'm sorry, like IEEE, are trying to find ways to put their stuff there because that's where people want to find it. You know, I mean, do you have an SPDX tag on your standard? Well, if you don't, if you're taking, your comments against the standard and you're not getting them as PRs, then a lot of people won't know where to find it or know what to do with them or be able to, communicate that in a modern development environment. So we are kind of fishing in the same streams now. There is a difference, which I think is worth mentioning, and this is not about licensing, which we'll get to later. Standards have the benefit of having 20 or 30 years of experience with government and large company procurement. People kind of know, institutional adopters kind of know we're a safe place to borrow material. And so if something is created as a standard, you don't get a lot of flack from some European Commission department that wants to adopt it because they're comfortable with standards. They know how to do that. The whole web accessibility movement, which was just practically missing from some of the early parts of the web, got started as a consortium project at W3C, and now it has been readopted and picked up and enacted its law in Europe. It's in everybody's guidelines and but basically the thing that made it comfortable for large agencies and large governments and large companies to broadly adopt it is because of the stability of having an infrastructure like W3C's approval process to rely on. So a benefit we get from open standards is that everybody knows what they are. The history of procurement of open source work has been spotty because a lot of lawyers and a lot of companies were very standoffish about it at first. It was seemed as a more chaotic process. Its licensing was regarded as not as clear and not as reliable. And so open source, as it matures, is finding a better kind of frame within procurement as a safer place. For us at Oasis, we are now actually creating some open standards using open source licenses. And so it's been sort of interesting to take that stuff back to an ISO or a procurement agent and say, yeah, it's a standard, but it's also open source. And yes, that's okay, and it won't bite you, which is kind of a new concept for a lot of traditional users. But what I want to convey here is that there's a sanctioning aspect. There's a operating according to known rules and procedures and licenses so that people know that as a source of whether it's code, specs, models, or APIs, that you're a safe place from which users can widely adopt your stuff. And that sense of how to run things safely and clearly and with known licensing and known consequences and known boundaries is hugely important when the people who we talk to come to us and say, hey, I heard there's this module from something called the node.js Foundation that does this yada yada thing, which I've never heard of. Can I use it? Is this as safe as if I went and used an ISO standard? Bottom line, you want the answer to be yes.
One thing that may make that really concrete, lawyers are like programmers. There's you could do a whole great panel just on analogies between lawyers and programmers, but one way that I think there's this, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And in the same way, we as lawyers seek to say, nobody ever got fired for choosing this license or choosing this standards body, right? Where it's a well accepted, everybody knows. Maybe you don't know the details, right? Like there are a lot of lawyers who use a lot of open source licenses who could not actually explain to you how they work, right? But because they're well understood, they're well, like they know that other lawyers know, and so there's that network effect of learning around these things.
Good, Wendy.
Yeah, and I think that serves as a way of sort of division of expertise, that programmers don't have to be experts in the licensing conditions or in all of the possible governance structures that could be used. They can take patterns from organizations that have done some of that work, found patterns that work well, and are relied upon, that work in legal enforcement, that work for government regulation, that work for communities. That our process, W3C's process, is often accused of being too long and unwieldy and too detailed, but at the same time, it saves people from reinventing that structure every time they're trying to make a new decision. Yes, sometimes you may need to reinvent something because conditions have changed, But if you're doing something that's been done before, the patterns that worked well in the past may well serve you too. And so that's low friction, low barrier to reuse. Helps get the focus on writing the best spec, making the best security considerations and privacy and accessibility and strong interoperability and testing, and the things that we need to get a clear base of running code.
So I want to ask about the importance of having multiple stakeholders, but you actually just touched on something, because we are speaking to a room of developers and programmers, and these documents are written for lawyers. What does a developer need to know about their open source license? Like, what's the thing? That's the small thing.
Well, there are two key bundles of rights that are included in most licenses: the copyrights and the patents. And copyright is a protection for ideas fixed in a tangible medium of expression. Your code is copyrightable, and those using it need a license that permits them to copy it as they do when they use or modify or run the code. And then and patents, which are more the idea, the function of code, and anyone can claim. Well, the inventor can claim protection of the functionality, even in something that somebody else implemented. And so a lot of open source licenses and a lot of standards bodies work to develop various ways of pooling patent protections or defensive rights, so that for example, at W3C, we have a royalty-free patent policy. Anyone who contributes participates in the development of a specification commits that they will not assert patents on even essential claims to that spec. That even if even if they have patents in their cupboard, they won't assert them against somebody who's trying to make an interoperable implementation of a spec.
Let me stick one. Let me stick one sit there. The significance there is that if you're doing something in Wendy's shop under that patent policy, not only is everybody promising that you can use their contribution, which is also open source world, right? But also they're promising that they won't sue you if you use the other guy's contribution. So if Wendy, Louie, I, and Jory are our committee, each of us may promise that we will let you use our contributions, duh. But also, if there's a final product, you come out of a process like a standards process, and this is true in a couple of open source projects, but not most. That also means that if you use my contributions, Louie won't sue you, and if you use Jory's contributions, Wendy won't sue you. This is a significant improvement in terms of stability. And so, for example, ripped out of the news yesterday. Anybody watch Twitter? See Jack Dorsey saying, "Oh gosh, I've just realized that maybe there should be a multi-company standard for tweets or for social media anyway." Okay, and that's great. Good for him. And without any comment other than that, I would love to see something like that happen. I'll just point out that W3C had a project on that 8 years ago. I mean, Evan Perlman made it up, who's up here by the way, made up StatusNet maybe 10 years ago now, and worked out a system for a while, and it became an activities at W3C, and they went through a whole thing. Basically, that whole idea got laundered through a process of multiple stakeholders and multiple contributors and final licenses. And so basically, yeah, Jack, we already have one of those. Now, maybe it'll be adapted, maybe something else will be better, but my point is, you are better off when you start from something that's been established through a process with multiple stakeholders, which is your point, and with some kind of stable understanding about the licenses, which is your point. And there are a lot of good things out there that have come from that process, which is why we're all advocates of reuse, not reinventing the wheel every time and refighting all the license battles.
I was actually going to say, Jory, you asked, like, what should we know?
Yes, yeah.
There's
In
really
short.
one thing you should know, and that is who else is using it,
Yeah.
right? Like, if you only know one thing, we are, and I say we here both about programmers and about lawyers, we are herd animals. And so the idea that, it's actually, there was a time when I first got involved in all this stuff, everybody knew all the licenses, right? Like literally to become a Debian developer, which was sort of, in some sense, the spiritual forerunner of being, of having a package on NPM, you literally had to pass a test to show that you knew all this stuff about all of the licenses, right? And in some ways, that was good. Everybody was an expert. Everybody had deep knowledge. And in other ways, that really got in the way of actually doing the thing we want to do, which is actually write some code, right? And and I think in some ways, there's a sense of something. There's some loss there, right? But it's also, I think, simply looking around the room and being like, you know what? The entire rest of the industry has been using the BSD license for 30 years,
Yeah.
and it hasn't melted down yet. Like that's actually a pretty good proof point for like actually maybe we can probably keep using it for the next 30 years, and it probably won't. Now, if you buy me a drink tonight, I will tell you all the ways in which it might melt down, but that's for another conversation.
Doom and gloom. But I think so. This came from Twitter, but I think there's a bit of a tension here, right, where we want to simplify things enough and just say, don't worry about it, developer community. Just it's okay, we got it covered. But at the same time, we want to make sure that these communities are like, knowledge is empowering. Like we want them to feel like this is knowable to them. And so, what is the right sort of balance for that, nervous developer who's trying to think about licensing their first project? Like really, is it just pick?
Well, I think if you're in a company, talk to your company's lawyers. If you're working on your own, talk to a friendly lawyer and think about what it is that you or your organization are trying to protect. What are you trying to create? And what sort of legal structure helps you to do that? And we have big companies and small companies and individuals who contribute to open standards and who contribute to that royalty-free pool because what they want to protect is the ability to interoperate and the ability to work with others in a safe environment where all of them know that none of them is going to pull a patent out of their back pocket and undermine this web we've created. And yeah, there's room for patents and there's room for proprietary stuff on top of that stack. You have the core interoperable web, and then you have optimizations that people can patent and applications that people can sell on top of that. And over time, the core of the common royalty-free piece grows, and there are new opportunities further out on the edge to develop something proprietary. And that grow the interoperable core and build something of your own on top is a powerful strategy, and it can be a good strategy for selling your services, for selling your products, for expanding the value that you provide and create.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key really is understanding what it is you want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this is a small piece of, I don't want to say throwaway JavaScript, right? But we know that there are a lot of modules on NPM that were a sort of weekend hack and are never going to be more than a weekend hack. And in that case, putting it under the same license that everybody else uses on NPM, BSD or MIT, something like that, so that everybody else just uses it in the same way they're used to, is probably going to achieve your goals, because your goals for publishing a weekend hack are like, I hope it's useful to somebody, and and if it is, great, and if it's not, I'm not going to worry about it, right? But if you're like trying to start a business, or you are already part of a business and you're trying to work with other businesses, then things get more complicated, and you have to ask deeper questions. I will say, there's a spectrum here of not knowing anything on one side, actually going to law school on the other side. Do not recommend that. If you're thinking of that, I will buy you the drink, and we'll discuss tonight. And somewhere in between, there are a lot of good resources. In particular, I really like, there's a board member of the Python Software Foundation, Van Lindbergh, also a former engineer turned lawyer, has written a really excellent book that explains a lot of these concepts in like engineer accessible frameworks, and I highly recommend that book, because it is, unfortunately, like the optimal level of understanding, if you're asking complex questions like how do I work with other companies, is probably closer to book length than panel length.
Of course.
I am blanking on the name of the book.
He's going to look up the name of the book for you. So if you're in that space, God willing, you do some of your work in an organization where they've got good and hardened rules, and you can generally conduct yourself without worrying about it because the rules take care of it for you. They license rules, but also disclosure rules. You know that node.js just adopted its a new IPR policy, as I understand it. So that I'm not an expert on it, but one of the questions is, okay, what does that cover? How does that cover me? How much disclosure is required? Am I in a competitive position where I am trying to donate some things, but keep other processes outside of my donation so that they can be my competitive advantage? If you read the old Shapiro and Varian book, Information Rules, it talks richly about how the way to play the open source game from a enterprise point of view is to figure out what to give away to enjoy network effects and what to keep for your own proprietary processes. Everybody is doing that. Everybody has some things, some UX, some method, some algorithm, some spin, some profile that's their secret sauce. The best thing I can tell you as a lawyer to non-lawyers is go into these things knowing darn well what your secret sauce is, if any, and what parts of it you're trying to give away and get everybody else to use, versus what parts of it you or somebody else in your environment is trying to keep for themselves. When you get that wrong, or when you're not clear, or when the organization where you're doing the work is fuzzy and not careful, you get problems. And if those problems involve large economic risks, people sue each other and bad things happen. One word, Rambus, Rambus. Look it up, 10, 20 years ago. Whole series of cases about a standards group that fell on each other like a pack of wild dogs because there were disclosures. The disclosures were thought to be not very clear. There was an allegation that you lied to me about your patent. Well, we didn't tell you. Well, we never said we didn't have one. Well, I'm going to sue you. Suit dismissed. Run to a regulator. Regulator looks at it and says, yeah, it wasn't against the rules because the rules are crappy, but it was deceptive anyway. You're under arrest. Big mess. So clear rules, good. Fair, clear disclosure, good. Working in places where they have clarity, good. And above all, knowing what you're trying to protect and knowing what you want to share.
So I think this segs really well into this discussion of how IP and patent policies of different organizations sort of reinforce commons. And I think you all were kind of touching on that. So I wonder, you were talking about sort of like if you were just doing your weekend project and you select MIT because everybody else is like that's sort of reinforcing that system. Can you speak to other ways in which our policies here can help reinforce that and improve the commons, so it's not so tragic?
Well, I can start with one. I mean, so the W3C royalty-free patent policy offers a sort of reciprocity term that you can condition the royalty-free promise on everyone else's promise to make their patents available on the same spec, on the same terms. And that reinforces the Ostrom principle of community, having a defined community. Those who are in and who are willing to commit to sort of sharing the work of keeping this open get the rights to your work as well. And those who want to free ride, who want to take but not give, well, they face the risk of litigation by any one of the participants who is otherwise making that their patents available royalty free. And so it's a, anyone is free to enter so long as they're willing to make that commitment. And that's sort of a little lightweight community boundary that says, here are the conditions, here are the rules that you need to agree to if you want to be part of this commons, and that helps to build the spirit of good faith interaction and cooperation that then can grow the commons.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. This is a tough one to unpack. So let me also give one example.
Yeah.
Right. So some of you may be aware that there's a couple different ways that you can say what the license on a code is. For a long time, the default was, I'm just going to have a file called copying, and I'm going to put the license in there, and that's going to be good enough, right? And then some large corporations got involved and were like, that still makes us a little nervous because we don't have, say Joe Schmo comes along and gives, submits a pull request. We didn't call them pull requests, but submits a pull request. Have they agreed to those legal terms in that one file? How do we know that their employer has agreed to those terms, right? So one of the first early evolutions in open source licensing was something called a contributor license agreement, where when a new contributor would come in off the internet and say, hey, I have an idea, here's a patch, the gears would grind to a halt and everybody would say, hey, that looks great, please fax me this doc, please print it out and fax it to me, or certified mail, also fine. And we will literally put it in a filing cabinet at the Apache Software Foundation, and we'll keep track of it just in case, right? And in fact, I'm aware of a situation. This is semi-public. Given my track record, you can probably guess who it is here. But I've been aware of a case where a company sued over a piece of code, and the Apache Software Foundation opened up their file cabinet and said, but you gave us this piece of code. It says right here, you gave it to us. And the company backed down, right? And so it wasn't a purely hypothetical, well, here's the thing. I have been doing this for 20 years now, and I'm aware of exactly one case in which that has been helpful, and there are literally thousands of these things on file, if not tens of thousands, right?
5 a year here.
Oh, okay.
When you're in a hardened environment, security systems, high value stuff, deep competition, that's not a real thing. By the way, Node.js has CLAs, doesn't it? I think you guys do it.
Well, we have a DCO.
I mean, you guys do it as bytes set in a GitHub register at the moment, but you got CLAs. It's just that they're not. We don't fax them anymore.
Well, but at some point somebody said, hey, you know what? In most of these cases, the original things were written such that you could literally if some random schmo off the internet submitted a patch, and it turns out they were lying about the source, you could sue them about it. Which was nice in theory, but in fact, as a practical matter, none of us are what lawyers call deep pockets, right? We're not if Oracle wants to come sue Joe Schmo, Oracle's going to realize the cost is not worth the benefit here, right? Because they are going to spend a lot more on lawyers than whatever Joe Schmo has in his pockets to give to Oracle, right? Oracle are vindictive sons of bitches, but they're not dumb.
Google's his client.
Former client, but I still have thoughts. So a lot of communities were a little concerned about this overhead of first faxing. Now it's GitHub stuff, but and so somebody said, you know what? Look, we're not gonna go ahead and sue this person. Why don't we optimize that out? And we'll focus on instead simply being able to notify people, hey, you should really owe this and own this before you give it to us, and we should know who gave it to us, right? And that is where you got the developer certificate of origin. The key point being there, we know where it came from, so that if somebody sues us, we can look into it and we can take that code out if we need to, right? And that's where a DCO comes in, which is the default, I believe, for
so all of the
OpenJS.
projects are actually on different things, and so that's part of this new policy as a new foundation is like, okay, can we start to figure out like what the standard practice ought to be among 30 some odd projects that have been doing it differently for a number of years.
And this is a great illustration. The problem that Node.js people have when designing a system like that is you got a bunch of people coming in with a bunch of different licenses, a bunch of different environments, a bunch of different practice in terms of people who like signing stuff and have a six-pack of lawyers, people who don't. Some people are comfortable with DCOs, some aren't, and so you have to construct a reasonably safe process. But let me try and abstract that into an action item for non-lawyers, okay? What this tells you is that your first question in a development situation where you're contributing stuff you care about into a project you care about is you need to decide whether you're in a relatively weasel-free environment. Because you see, if you are full of weasels, like arguably the Rambus people, or some of Louis' clients, or maybe I should say clients' opponents, but your mileage may vary.
My clients are all good.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. If you're in a weasel-free or a highly competitive or a dueling licenses, pistols at dawn environment, then all this stuff is going to matter a lot more, and you get a lot more chance of contributing a whole lot of things that can then get swiped away from you or overridden, or your project's suddenly been deep-sixed because of a lawsuit or a threat of a lawsuit, because believe me, a lot of the people dealing this are not brave warriors. They're craven. If you go booga booga, I'm going to sue you, they fold. And if you go booga booga, I'm going to sue you, and you got a lot of money. I guess the Oracle Google case, on which we have no opinion because we have contributions from both sides, you got two rather large companies who are apparently not afraid of spending legal. I assume that when one of them calls the other, the reaction on the other end of the phone is, oh my God, stars and garters were lost. But a lot of the battles between parties who have opposite technical or licensing or patent positions are asymmetric. This is not a level playing field.
Yeah.
So figure out how treacherous and how weasel-free your environment is, and then you will know how much you want to sort of run for safety and make sure that you're working within a highly structured process, or a process that has professional referees, a process that's got a lot of output and has a lot of connections into other systems, so that there's going to be people who run interference for you. Because I can assure you that when something goes to hell in a standards or open source project at my shop or Wendy's, we get calls, and we try to help them navigate it in some appropriate way without taking sides, and that can be a very important function. So the maturity of an organization also goes to, when that crazy thing happens, can you get help?
Yeah, let me add one other. An unfortunate part of our profession is that we are all professional pessimists. It is our job to see the issues coming. Like we have finely tuned weasel radar, and we see those weasels from a lot further off than you do. Now, sometimes they are imaginary weasels, right? And so the balancing thing here, right, is that we sometimes have to be the ones who are delivering this bad news of because circumstances change, right? When you were talking earlier about the patent situation, I couldn't help but think when we all got involved, patent litigation about software. Well, actually, this might not be true for you, Jamie, but the software litigation about patent litigation about software rather, has come in waves, right? Where it didn't, for a long time, we didn't even think that software was patentable, and then we thought software was very patentable, and now we're back to maybe it's not very patentable again. So it feels like a little bit of a peaceful time right now. There are no weasels on the horizon, but in fact, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, I'm not going to call them weasels. On we're being recorded. Hi, yes, they're wonderful, except when they're not. And then one day you wake up and all of a sudden software is patentable again, and all the lawyers, like, it's so depressing to me, like, engineers come to me full of all this energy, and it's like, just help me build the thing. And you're like, okay, but bad news may come, and you have to be the one who bears that bad news preemptively.
Yeah, I want to sort of add that a lot of our sort of long-term weasel radar is looking at edge cases and exception handling, and litigation is for the most part in software and the exception. Most of what we're doing is not suing one another, and most of what we're doing in standards and open source is trying to find cooperative solutions, because the web isn't going to work, the node software isn't going to work if it doesn't work together. And saying I'm going to sue you for not interoperating with me is a pretty poor way of getting interoperability. Much better to say, what can you live with? What can I live with? Where's a compromise that makes each of us enough better off that we've got a package that works, we've got a standard that works, we've got an API that we all agree to implement, not because someone comes down with a lawsuit saying thou shalt, but because that's what's going to work for our product and our customer teams and our collaborators.
I mean, absolutely. We all have this radar for problems. The best lawyers are the ones who have the radar for problems and help you get to a solution anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's unfortunately, I think, what separates not great lawyers from great lawyers, and we're all spoken for. So, but we have a Rolodex. So if you ever have a lawyer saying no to you, come find us, and we'll hook you up with somebody who will find a way to say, find a way to give you answers.
One more thing. All the stuff that we're doing that we think of as being web interface, cool, screens, mobile, all that, the things you hear 90% of the work here talked about this, that's one part of the world, and perhaps that is a relatively weasel-free environment, as Lewis suggests. But I got to tell you, I do, and I know Wendy's shop is doing a lot of work in automotive, in IoT, in security, and those are not 5G, good God, telecoms. Those are not weasel-free or patent-free domains. So I think it would be. I should say, I was just listening to the technical steering committee of Node.js earlier today, and hearing the guys talk about all their ports of the basic core over into all kinds of funky devices that aren't anything like a laptop. They got a whole bunch of satellites and Lord knows what else running this stuff on esoteric chips that haven't been invented yet. So we are up in that patent-filled space, even here.
I actually think that we are in for a bout of copyright trolling in this space as well. How many of you have actually read all the way through the BSD or MIT licenses? All right. Okay. Well, so. I got right. Yeah. No, I'm not going to read it now. I will tell you that the sort of common mythology about these licenses is that do whatever you want. And that is mostly true, except for the asterisk of, but if you deliver the software to somebody, you've got to give them a copy of this license. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, that is not hard to do, and yet virtually nobody does it, right? And somebody is going to, just as the previous talk in this room was in part about people inserting deliberate security vulnerabilities into people's web stacks, I think we are going to see somebody insert a deliberate legal vulnerability. Mm-hmm. They're going to build a useful library or buy a useful library from the copyright holder, and then they're going to use one of the scanning tools to essentially say, hey, I noticed that your website is using my library.
You're talking like you think that hasn't already
happened. I have never seen public record of it happening. There's amicus brief, safe word.
Brief, yes, yeah. You're also kind of moving toward that last question that I was going to ask about predictions. But before we get to that, I wanted to make sure that we talked about the other thing that I know that this room cares quite a bit about, which is the sustainability of the commons. and sort of the funding piece, because lawyers play a big role in sort of figuring out the business of open source as well. I think everybody here cares about that, and I imagine Tidelift has something to say about it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we have observed that there's a lot of money floating around for really high-profile projects, right? And this is something that WC3, I think, and Oasis have seen as well. If you have something that's way up at the top of the stack, there's a lot of money floating around in the system right now. It's not that hard to get funding for it, right? It's not easy, but it's doable. But then you do a scan of what people are actually using, and there's literally hundreds of libraries that are somebody's part-time project. And that plays into questions like the security vulnerabilities that we were seeing earlier and the general just cost of using this stack, right? You have all spent time discovering that some library you thought that you were relying on is like, oh, this actually hasn't been updated in 4 years, and now it doesn't work with something else, and you know, um, and we think that way of doing business is bad for developers, right? Like it leads to burnout, it leads to abandoning projects that you once loved, but your day job is now. Your day job switched from being a Java shop to a Ruby shop, and now your Java projects are abandoned, right? Or I mean, this is obviously a JavaScript shop, but things that were dependent on jQuery, now everybody's moving to Vue or pick your flavor of the week, right? And that leads to a lot of costs for the businesses that are using it. So we think that at least part of the solution here is actually treating this like a business, right? Not just a charity, but actually going out and saying, hey, your business depends on this. We can make it more reliable if we pay the developers who are doing the work. And that is one approach. There's many others, right? Open Collective is great. They are doing the pass the hat kind of thing. There's industry consortia, right? I mean, W3C, Oasis, Linux Foundation are all essentially passing the hat at the industrial scale in some sense, right? And that in certain spaces works very well. Tidelift thinks that that's not going to work for those smaller pieces of things, right? So that's sort of where we're focused on. I don't want to turn this into a pitch session, but anybody who wants to talk about it, feel free to come. My other hat, we're small enough that I am human resources. I'm the general counsel, and I also head our DevRel team. So I drew the long straw of coming to Montreal in December.
Yes.
I am the San Francisco office. No, that's not true. As of last week, we have 2 people in San Francisco. So I don't know if you
Let me have some fun with this and throw a rock. One of the ways that the balance between big and little players, patent holders, trolls, and non-combatants, and other sort of asymmetrical parties are going to be disrupted is a prediction I'm going to offer you. And that is, in spite of the fact that everybody makes fun of it, and in spite of the fact that all these fat old cis white guys like me who run some of the older organizations seem to not take it seriously, the ethical license people are going to prevail at some point, okay? The all software is good no matter what, everybody can use anything, and I don't care if my stuff is used to jail babies people. The old school open source approach that says no one gets to withhold their labor from anything no matter how evil, that's not going to be the only model forever. Read ethical license. Search the phrase ethical license if you're not familiar with this. There is a growing set of what I would call new wave approaches or differences or twists on open source licensing that basically create exceptions for various reasons. And some of those are going to exclude some large organizations. And that's going to mess this all up. It's coming. I can see it from here. We don't know what's going to happen yet. I don't know how fast it's going to happen. But there will be people who are willing to contribute to the commons for some purposes, but not for other purposes. And that will also cause some kind of regrouping or segregation or set of conditions that will have to be coped with. Just as the GPL license was disruptive 15, 20 years ago, and it basically landed in a field of other licenses, and everybody looked at it and said, whoa, 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 but if I use this, I can't use anything else. And oh my God, stars and garters. I mean, believe me, the people who were in our jobs as IPR lawyers for software 20 years ago almost all had vapors about the GPL because they couldn't figure out how to use it with anything else and not have the world break. And it took a while for people to figure out that there are actually, you can have modules next to other modules. And even Moglen wrote some things to make it clear that this wasn't, eating the entire world. It was just for certain areas, and that there are ways for this stuff to coexist. And they created the LGPL, and they made it easier. But there will be more perturbation in licensure and more people insisting that other values be supported. And that will destabilize and mess up some of these current relationships and power relationships, which I think is going to be really interesting. Hopefully I retire before it hits.
Because I've got thoughts on that one.
I like love that you decided like at the very end of this to open the ethical licensing can of worms, Jamie. It's awesome. We are kind of running low on time, so I think I will ask you all to make your predictions for 2020. Louis.
Boy, I mean, Jamie stole mine right out of the. I 100% agree that that's going to be. I think the other interesting thing is going to be. This is maybe not a 2020 thing, but in the next, say, 3 to 5 years, the security presentation from the Sneak Guy here was terrifying. Right, nothing new, but put a lot of things together. This idea that we can write some letters in all caps. And for those of you who have, since I guess none of you read the BSC license, it's got this all caps section that basically says, oh yeah, if you break it, if it's broken, hey, not my problem, your problem.
As is where is bug off.
Right, yeah. And that's, I think at some point that's not going to hold, right? I think the security risks to the literally civilization are going to be too high, and we're all going to have to clean up. And I don't know how lawyers are going to be involved in that, but I suspect we will.
I think in the doom and gloom portion of predictions, I think we're seeing regulators and legislators being lots more interested in what we create with code, whether that's round 3 of the encryption wars of law enforcement need backdoors. Sorry, you can't build a secure backdoor. Build us one anyhow. Or liability for platforms and for what users post on them. CDA 230 is the protection that platforms have had against being liable for what users post. Yet we're more and more concerned about abuse, about misinformation, about harassment online, and finding the right balance between who takes responsibility, how, and what are the legal hooks for that responsibility. How do we build these other kinds of communities on top of software without undermining the protections that we have for building good software. Is I think going to be a challenge of our next, say, 5 years.
Any optimistic predictions?
Sure, I got it.
Okay.
Kick off doom and gloom.
Let's let a light note.
I think we're going to find that all of the current hyper-categorized beliefs that a standard and a code module and a model and a markup and an API are all different things is going to fall away and simplify. Because you know what? We are in a world now where all that stuff is one transform away from another, and some of the transforms are canonical and bilateral and actually freaking work, which is not where we were a few years ago. So I think we're going to find that the output you create in whatever form or serialization happens to exist in, whether it's a code or a spec or an API, whatever it is, we're going to discover that there's a much more uniform set of safe principles and methods for procuring, finding these things. I mean, why do we find code or score people's PR points on GitHub using code, but we don't do that with standards? Why are Oracle and Google spending $50 million arguing over what an API is? We're using the damn things all the time. Why are we agonizing over their exact categorization? I think some of those artificial distinctions are going to fall away, and it's actually going to render what we all do a lot simpler. And so just as we used to see some of the integrated development environments do this, you won't be having people hand code so much in these stuff. You'll be seeing people creating models and then being able to implement them immediately without having to get in there like Keebler's elves and handcraft every piece of it. And I think as all that unifies more, it will create a simpler and safer environment where a lot of these sneaky distinctions that weasels use to mess up your life will fall away.
We're going to keep winning.
Yay.
I mean, I think that's the idea that open source would literally take over the world in the way it has would have sounded ludicrous 20 years ago, even 10. And all the griping that we've got here at the table, that's all at the edges of the thing, right? Like the core model works, and we're going to keep winning, and that's still sometimes I wait. There's like a legal conference, all lawyers get together. Microsoft has started attending all of these with their lawyers, right? Like that was sort of my big like, oh right,
Yeah.
this is real.
We're
won.
winning.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that. That I think we're getting better at building communities around around the code, and communities that have values and ethics and privacy practices and other things that we value, as well as the quality of the code and its interop. So I think we're getting better at building code for good society.
Absolutely. Got time for one anecdote?
All we do is win.
Ooh,
No matter what.
let's debate that one some other day.
I don't want to take away from DJ Khaled over there, but I know a foundation that I work with who was agonizing over how to create a testing and sort of a certification program, and they had this debate that went kind of like this. Well, should we just issue reference code and make everybody use it? Or should we create a model and require everybody to obey the model? Or should we create an API as a specification and spell it all out, make everybody obey the data structure and the code? Because they needed wide interoperability across a whole bunch of governments for a complicated purpose. Or should we just set up a test client and say, this isn't canonical, but it's a reference implementation, and if you can talk to it, you win. And you know what their answer was actually? Their answer was, don't care. Any one of those works. Mm-hmm. Which is my point.
Yeah.
Right? If we can get to agreed structures, then you don't have to sit up all night with the teams of lawyers worrying about the little rococo technical details of how you license this little piece of that, and whether it's really an API or not, and whether it's really copyrightable or not, or how the patent lawyer should approach it. If you make this stuff simple, it works. And as Louis says, we're open development is winning. Yeah. Thank heaven.
Well, panelists, if any of that happens, I'll ask you about it next time at the next Node plus JS Interactive.
Who's been watching Wait, Don't Tell Me?
Everyone, I will just give it up for these very generous attorneys, and please do come to speak with them today about the W3C, Tidelift, or Oasis. Thank you all very, very much.